appreciate your kind words and your introduction. Let me thank the Andrew Walls Center, and particularly Dr. Kwiani, for this invitation. I am a visiting fellow of the Andrew Walls Center, and I've been, as Prof Walls indicated, visiting in the past at Liverpool in many of the colloquia and summer schools. And it's a privilege to be offering this colloquium today. I believe most of you received the paper in the PDF format. It was published already in 2017, almost 4 years ago. So some of the information is slightly outdated, but I will inform you about that as we go along. The first subsection of the paper has to do with challenges facing theological education in South Africa. And we have to start by looking at the educational legacy of colonialism and apartheid and the role it played. And part of the destructive legacy that we struggle with in South Africa is in the area of education. It has caused a number of gaps to open up. Right, if we can go to the structure, the second one. So there's basically two main sections. Section 2 is challenges facing, and chapter 3 is a sort of a framework for addressing it in terms of multilingual theological learning. Now, the four gaps, if you can move to the next one, please, Harvey. There are four gaps that have opened up because of our political, economic, and racist legacy. The first is an intellectual divide between school and university. So in teaching theology at university level, students come from various backgrounds ill-prepared for academic learning in South Africa due to the legacy. So they struggle with reading English because the theological teaching is all in English or in Afrikaans at some universities, but increasingly only in English. And so students who've grown up in a isiZulu or Sesotho or Afrikaans backgrounds often don't understand the terminology well. So that's the first gap. The second one is an intercultural gap between students in the same class in a residential university or in the same group at a distance university like Unisa. Students don't share the same worlds. They grew up in different church backgrounds, quite often different cultural, linguistic. And so the communication between students is complicated in a class or in a study group. The third gap is an internal one in the mind of a student who's now, by HML, I mean home and ministry language, the language that students speak at home or in which they minister. Now at Unisa, most of our students are not young, coming directly from school. They're already practicing ministers, pastors in different churches, or experienced people in other fields who are now studying theology as a sort of a second career. So the gap in the mind of a student between learning theology in English, but praying and reading the Bible and preaching and doing pastoral care in another language, in an African language. So that's a gap which is difficult to manage. One colleague of ours at Unisa, Sam Tsefla, wrote, and that's on the page 2 if you're following in the paper, my tertiary education seems to have had an equally alienating effect on me in relation to the Christian community from which I emerged. My theological upbringing obviously did not proceed in their language. And so frustration reigns whenever they expect insights from me and I'm unable to articulate such in terms of their culture and language. The apparent inability to engender a fruitful dialogue between my experience as a Mosotho and my theological training is thus unsettling. So the effect of this gap is that there's a one-directional flow from English to the other languages. So it perpetuates the Eurocentric epistemologies and theologies. It inhibits the real flourishing of a contextual African theology. It also robs people from English-speaking, Afrikaans-speaking backgrounds, often from the wealth and the riches of African spiritualities, of students in the same class, but unable to articulate it clearly in that language. So, and then there's a structural gap between church ministry and the academy. That's commonly reflected on. I don't want to speak about the general problem of academy and church, but the specific problem that the question remains how a theological curriculum can bridge the gap between theological learning in English and public ministry practice in an African language. A theological curriculum that evades this challenge fails to empower African languages to become academic sources and resources and vehicles in their own right. It also deprives English language theology of the challenge and enrichment emanating from African language theologizing. So these are the four gaps we face that we need to deal with. If you can go to the next slide, please, Harvey. What effect does this have? Well, one effect is the racializing of cultural identity, and thereby of our intercultural relationships. Because the word apartheid has become the sort of the name by which the South African problem was known, it seems to suggest that people are apart, but horizontally apart, whereas that was not the whole problem. The problem was that Black communities and Black languages were disadvantaged and pushed down. So it's our cultures were racialized through apartheid. That was one of our biggest problems. Race and culture became identified in many people's minds, and inferior cultures and lower races created a problem that we can't have healthy cultural affirmations. Our culture has been tainted and racialized, and therefore when we try to affirm our own cultures, the question of race always intrudes and complicates our intercultural relationship. So one of our biggest challenges is to de-racialize culture in South Africa. I'll come back to this a little bit later. So the effect then is that some people feel that if you're emphasizing cultural distinctives or your own language, that this is taking us back to the past. It's reintroducing apartheid. If you want to come and emphasize that I want to do theology in isiZulu or in Afrikaans or in Sesotho, that seems to sound like apartheid. In other words, the perception is that those cultural affirmations are racial affirmations. So to separate those two is one of our biggest challenges. So if we go to the next slide, please, Harvey. How does one do multilingual theological learning then? Now, in societies where there's one dominant language, or maybe two languages, you only need to talk about bilingual learning. But in a country like South Africa and many other countries in the world, increasingly with migration, you have many languages in the same class simultaneously. And if you want to, so this concept of multi-bilingual has been developed to suggest that students need to be able to become competent in English as a lingua franca meaning the trading language, the language in which we trade with each other. But trade isn't everything you do, it isn't all you do. You also have another language in which you do home stuff when you're not trading with others. And so to to develop competence in English as a lingua franca and in your HML, your home ministry language, and to develop those two competencies simultaneously and together. So that's this concept of multibilingual is how you would have in a class, you would have the Zulu speakers, the Sotho speakers, Afrikaans speakers, who are home language speakers, would be in a group, either 2 by 2 or in a small group, so that you can have breakaway sessions around language. So the shared part of the class will be in English as a training language, and then you would have group discussions in the other language, and then feedback again. So it's a kind of a scissors movement. It opens and it closes, and it opens and it closes. You talk together in English, you talk separately in your home languages, and you talk together again. But when you talk separately, you're not facing away from each other. You're facing in the same direction, shoulder to shoulder. You're trying to build a common theology, a common life, a common Christianity, a common faith, a common political, economic system as well, you think broadly. But it starts narrowly here in theology. So speaking face-to-face in this learned lingua franca, and then speaking separately in our home and ministry languages to develop those as theological languages in their own right, not against English, not against each other, but shoulder to shoulder, so that as the scissor opens and closes and opens and closes, an intercultural space, learning space, is opened up, where we are both together and we are separate, and we can celebrate both of those, not in separatist theologies, but not in just a common mishmash theology where the dominant always assimilate the marginalized, and therefore nobody really feels happy or comfortable. So it's an attempt, this sort of pedagogy, you can say, to have bilingual, so everybody becomes bilingual, but it's multi-bilingual because it's not just one other language in addition to English. It's a number of different languages. So you have to have subgroups. All right, so what's important then is the study material. There must be study material in these different languages that students can use as a basis for their discussion in the 2x2 buddies or in a small group discussion. And so the dictionary is an attempt to provide a first tool, as Professor Walls has called it. I think it's well expressed as it's a tool. It's merely a tool. It's nothing more than that. But to kickstart and to stimulate theological reflection in languages other than English, because they have not been developed as theological languages. They are preaching languages, and there are Bible translations in all those languages, but they're not theological in the serious sense of the word, that publications in theology are made, or that serious theology is done. It's sort of like the serious theology is done in English, and the application is done in the African languages. And therefore they are not at the same level, and therefore the movement is one direction, unidirectional instead of multi-directional. Now, for this scissors movement to work, it needs to be facilitated very well, because it can be very easily interrupted or capsized with one aggressive person or one narcissist in the meeting can disturb it. So how to facilitate this roots and wings experience of we are rooted in different cultural and even spiritual experiences, but we also are winged so that we can fly towards each other, listen, learn from each other, explore together, and having both roots and wings, and developing our roots, strengthening our roots in culture, language, experience, and strengthening our ecumenical, intercultural, intergender interrace, whatever the fault lines there are in our societies, to be both rooted and winged. So if we can go to the next one then, no, wait. Yes, to the next slide, please. So now it's about the dictionary. I'm not going to talk about the background of the project at Unisa. It's in the paper if you want to read it up. I want to speak more about the format. So in terms of lexicography, it would be called a descriptive dictionary, synchronic, multilingual, technical, and restricted. Now, each of those are jargon terms in terms of lexicography. I'm not going to expand on it. We can talk about it if you want to ask a question. At the moment, there are 1250 entries, and each entry is in 4 languages: English, isiZulu, Sesotho, and Afrikaans. They are short definitions. In English, which is sort of the mother text, you can say its definitions are average 70 words in length. Sometimes, quite often, the translations in Afrikaans and isiZulu and Sesotho are longer than 70 words because of the nature of language. Most of the primary entries are in English. The reason for this is that originally it was perceived, this dictionary, as a help for first-year students in theology who get this English language study guide and they read the word eschatology and they don't know what eschatology means, and so they can look it up in an English dictionary, but if they don't understand the English explanation, they struggle to get hold of the meaning. So it gives the entry in the lingua franca and in your own language, or as close to your language as possible, so that you can develop that bilingual competence in English and in your home language, your ministry language. Some primary entries are in African languages, terms that I'll give a few examples a bit later. But it's not a dictionary in the sense that it has only terms or words. There are some concepts. Some of the entries are about documents. Some are about persons. Some are about churches. Some are about events. Some are about organizations. So it's more of a resource book rather than a traditional dictionary which sort of explains individual words. So maybe the next slide, Harvey, gives an example of one entry on the Mpilo Desmond Tutu. So that's just an example of there's more or less 70-word explanation of who he was in English, then in isiZulu, then in Sesotho, and then in Afrikaans. In the paper, the example is on Black Theology. I thought I'd just give another one. Now, the next few slides give examples of a small selection of the kind of entries. So maybe you can move to the next one. This is just an example of some names, some persons on whom there are entries in the dictionary. European theologians, African politicians, theologians, evangelical, Reinhard Bonke evangelists, Catholic saints, etc., men and women. So that's sort of the kind of persons. This is a very small selection out of the 1250. The next slide is about concepts, just a small selection, but you see there are some like Busadi and Ubuntu that are African terms in isiZulu and Sesotho respectively. Then there are Latin, Greek terms, expressions. Those are some of the concepts. The next one is on, the next slide is on documents, creeds, confessions, declarations. And the next slide is on different churches. Now, obviously, the focus is on Southern Africa, South Africa mainly. So in many of these churches, there would be an entry on Catholic Church and then Catholic Church in South Africa, or the Methodist Church and then the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, because it's clear that these churches do not exist only in South Africa, and they have a history outside of South Africa that's important to in order to understand the South African experience, manifestation of it. The next slide is also quite a bit of organizations, great focus on South Africa here, but also CELAM, that's Latin American Episcopal Catholic Bishops Conference, world federations, etc., academic societies like New Testament Society. And then the next slide, some events, ecumenical events, councils, then Vatican councils, and political church consultations in South Africa, Cottesloe and Rustenburg. Also events like the Sharpeville massacre that had huge theological implications and faith implications. And I think there's another one. No, that's just a slice of examples of the kind of entries that are in the dictionary. Now, how can such a dictionary play a role in a multilingual learning, multi-bilingual learning process? First of all, when printed out, I have a copy here, just one printout, it's 430 pages. So obviously we are not thinking of printing and distributing it, but making it available digitally on a website. We being Unisa has the ownership of the document, because it paid the team who wrote, a team of 3 people. It was myself, an isiZulu theologian, and a Sesotho-speaking theologian who worked on the dictionary. So we'll make it available on a website or an app. The feeling is not only to Unisa students, but to anybody who can benefit from it. But of course, a dictionary isn't a curriculum, it's merely a tool. So it's got to be integrated into a curriculum in which, if it's a class situation, a residential situation, that this dictionary, these entries are used in the breakaway groups, so that when the isiZulu speakers and the Sesotho speakers are separate, the Afrikaans speakers, they would then have this as a basis for their discussion. For example, asking whether this is a good translation of the English, whether this is a good explanation in Sesotho, or to say, but hang on, there are other elements in our experience of Christianity that this entry sort of evokes in us. We would like to discuss this further and bring it back then in English to the, in a kind of report back session. But so the dictionary is intended to be a first set of theological writing in isiZulu, in Sesotho, in good grammar, well formulated, so that students can begin to develop their grammatical excellence in their home language, in theology, and gradually grow in that and develop it more strongly, and then give feedback into the face-to-face sessions again. But so it has to be integrated into a curriculum. In a distance teaching setting, it'll be more used, I think, in assignments. For example, to say to a student, well, use the following 5 entries and discuss this with your minister or your other members of your church or people down your street. Does this make sense to explain the concept of salvation or holiness or grace in this way? There are entries on grace and salvation, etc. To try to get contextual theologizing going by a student who's a distance teaching student, to talk theology with the people in her community, and to to find out how adequate this, not only the translation is, but how adequate this understanding of salvation is, or this understanding of grace is. And then bring back the songs and the prayers and the proverbs used in that particular language community to enrich and to thicken that explanation of what grace or salvation or whatever the topic is. But out of this dictionary, if it works, it would have to give birth, it'll be a little crystal that will, around which will crystallize much more study material in different languages, so that the students grow up to develop the expertise to start writing theology in Sesotho and isiZulu and commentaries on scripture or whatever it is, of course, so that the dictionary kickstarts, seeds a process of further bilingual theologizing in both English and in the home language. I've spoken about that slide, so maybe we can go to the next one. There are many aims of the dictionary, but two that I just want to highlight in this connection is, I've actually already said it, it's stimulating students to further theological reflection in their respective home languages, ministry languages, to extend their vocabulary. I've often heard preachers in the church, the Reformed church I belong to, preaching Sesotho, and then they throw in English words like reconciliation or holiness in between because they don't know the Sesotho word for that, because they haven't studied their theology in Sesotho. They've studied in English, and so sanctification is the word that pops out when they're speaking freely, because they haven't got that word in Sesotho. The word is there, but they don't have it available in their minds as they speak. So it is to extend their vocabulary, to improve their grammar and style. Now, languages are changing all the time. Cultures are in constant flux. So this is not a sort of a nativist reification of culture or of language. It is to speak and to write the way people speak and write, not fixing it into some kind of static past, but nevertheless there are rules. I mean, in Afrikaans, there are different dialects in Afrikaans, but there are different acceptable boundaries within each dialect. That just makes it easily understandable and credible if you communicate in that language in that way. I think then it's important to invite students to evaluate the entries, to improve them, to give feedback, to expand on them, thereby developing their skill to think theologically in their home language, as well as in English. So there's the bilingual competence. My ideal, and it's probably a pipe dream, but that in a, let's say, a Bachelor of Theology qualification, a student would be examined at the end regularly, but also then in the final exam, that the outcome of a bachelor's degree would be theological competence in English and your home language, and that they would be both assessed, maybe in slightly different ways, but not in the way that the English is assessed in a written exam and the Sesotho in a sermon. Not different in that kind of way, the theory and the application, as if those can be separated in that kind of way. But so that is sort of part of the, you could say, the ideology or the vision of how this dictionary could be used. So the next slide, please, Harvey. I think that's the last one. Future developments. Now, the dictionary itself needs to be further developed. I'm sure you've seen the gaps already. First of all, I think the usefulness of the format needs to be assessed. 70-word definitions are very short. You can say very little in 70 words. So is it useful at all? Isn't it better just to have a term rather than a short definition? Shouldn't it be much longer or much less? then also the format in the sense of, are the entries, the kind of entries, helpful? Is this really what's beginning students in theology need, what they need most? So it could then mean adding more entries. Certainly 1250 is a tiny drop in the bucket of relevant theological terms for a student at university level. So many need to be added. Many perhaps need to be subtracted, need to be taken out. If, as I was suggesting before, they might not really be necessary or relevant. Adding more languages is crucial. I mean, there are many more than 4 languages in South Africa. Most South African students in the Nguni language group can understand Zulu reasonably well, isiXhosa and Swati and Sindebele. And in the Sotho group, Setswana, Sepedi, Sotho, about 90% of South African students can be close to the 3 African languages, either Afrikaans, Sesotho, or isiZulu. But that's not good enough. Tshivenda, Xitsonga, and the other languages need to be included. So there's a lot more work to be done, not again to reify and not again for an apartheid project, but simply to honor those rootedness, differently rootedness of our Christian experience, of our Christian spiritualities. And then Shona and Kiswahili and any other African language. And maybe a similar concept could be used in Eastern Europe, in the United States with English and Spanish. I don't know whether this is a useful format. That's the kind of question that needs to be evaluated. All of this will need a network of partners who would buy in and say, well, we think the idea is good, so we'd like to engage and work on improving the kind of entries, the quality of the entries, and the number of entries, so that the churches, the names of the churches will then also come from Kenya and Uganda and Ghana, etc., Nigeria. That might, you'll need a champion, a young champion to run with a ball like that, but that's possible future developments of the dictionary. But extending the use of the dictionary could also go in other ways. Developing the facilitation. This scissors pedagogy is a very delicate one, I think a very important one. But developing the mediation skills and the facilitation skills for such multi-bilingual processes, that's going to be crucial if this kind of model is to work. Then, of course, one can do research with or for the dictionary. You could get a student to write, for example, a master's dissertation on developing entries in English and her home language on a number of different topics that are not yet in the dictionary. So you produce the entries, which is just the tip of the iceberg, and then the whole theological justification in literature and interviews and focus groups in order to try and hone down a well-formulated entry in Kiswahili or isiZulu or whatever the language is. And a number of languages in an area could be a very interesting research project at the master's level, for example, in honing the skills of bilingual theologizing. That could enhance the dictionary. The dictionary could also be used for assessing how people understand theological concepts, not to try to add more entries, but to use the entries in interviewing people or in a focus group, let people discuss the entry, church members, not necessarily theologians, or it could be a group of pastors of a church, to see whether this dictionary can kickstart not just people training people for ordination, but facilitating ecumenical discussion among church members and church leaders already out in the field. And then workshops, possibly with ministers, to use this kind of dictionary in their sermon preparation or in preparing Bible studies, etc., because there are no commentaries available in most African languages. We all read English commentaries. So if one can have workshops with ministers to see how this kind of dictionary can facilitate better transfer of information from the English commentaries to the communication situations in which they are, and then back into actually maybe even writing good contextual commentaries in African languages on portions of scripture. I'm going to stop there. And it's fortunately slightly less than 40 minutes, which gives a little bit more time for interaction and discussion. Thank you, Harvey.